After buying a second-hand caravan some years ago, it wasn't the intention of Liz and I to engage on an historical pilgrimage around the various sites in the UK. It just sort of seemed to happen that way. Our meanderings in this context started out on the Northumbrian coast at Holy Island, or, as it's more properly known, Lindisfarne, which is the most northerly of the Farne Islands. The Farne Islands were home to Grace Diling, who, with her father, who was the keeper of the Longstones Lighthouse, became famous for a rescue carried out in 1838. She is buried in St Aidan's churchyard in Bamborough. Aidan was a notable character in the Celtic monastery community at Iona on the west coast of Scotland. He was succeeded by Cuthbert as leader of the community, and a history of Cuthbert's life is the oldest known English historical document. The most famous documents from here are, of course, the Lindisfarne Gospels, dating from the late 7th century and attributed to the monk Eadfrith, who became Bishop of Lindisfarne Priory in 698. The Gospels now reside in the British Museum, although both a facsimile and a digital replica is on display at the Heritage Centre, which is a rather unassuming looking building in the middle of the village. The monastery was a centre for evangelism in the north of England, although they faced persecution from the Vikings, who began raiding in 793 with a particularly bloody attack. The raids were comparatively short-lived, the period lasting for only 40 or 50 years. The main threat was about 100 years later, with the invasion and settlement by the Danes in East Anglia, who extended their control northwards to Northumbria. They were dark days for Christians, although by the new millennium, Scandinavia was beginning to convert to Christianity. The Christian witness at the priory continued until the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. It was a place of pilgrimage in medieval times and has seen a revival more recently, with groups of pilgrims often lugging a large wooden cross, trekking across the sand and mud to commemorate Christian festivals. It's marked out by these poles, and it's only accessible for an hour or two either side of low water. There's also a causeway to the island, which also covers at half tide and still catches out the unwary motorist despite the warning signs. This picture is taken from a refuge tower halfway across. We attended the parish Eucharist while we visited the island, as we were there on a Sunday, and the church has a couple of interesting carvings, one of which represents the removal of Cuthbert's coffin by the monks to a place of safety in the face of Viking raids. There is a cave about 10 miles away, which, according to legend, was used to hide the relic before his final resting place in Durham some time later. Locally, of course, we have a St Cuthbert's Church in Copner. Our next stop on this odyssey was the island of Iona, just off the southwestern tip of Mull in the Inner Hebrides. It had a monastery, these being some of the Celtic crosses from that period. And the monastery was founded by the Irish monk Columba, who arrived with 12 companions in 563. It was from here that the Picts in the late 6th century, and then shortly after the Kingdom of Northumbria in 635, were converted to Christianity. This bronze, if you note the dove at the top, is representative of the Holy Spirit flowing through the life of the believer. The monks of Iona are also thought to have been the scribes who produced the Book of Kells, the lavishly illuminated Bible. The style of the illustration is both Celtic and Scandinavian. I noticed very similar carvings when visiting one of the Norwegian stave churches a few years ago. Even the privations of the Viking raids couldn't quench their witness, and despite some 68 of the monks being killed during one particular raid in 806, there is today a St Magnus church in Orkney, indicative that later Norse rulers had embraced Christianity in subsequent years. These are some of the monuments and inscriptions from those early times of Christian witness in Britain. In modern times, the Iona community was founded by the Reverend George MacLeod in 1938 and now has an international reach with members around the world. The focus is on ecumenical liturgy, and the tradition of worship and meditation is somewhat similar in nature to that of Taizé. John Smith, the Labour leader from the early 90s, is buried in the churchyard, as is that famous Scottish monarch, Macbeth. As I said, we've visited these sites without specifically planning them as our primary itinerary. It just worked out that way. Historically, pilgrimage routes were, and indeed still are, big business. One of the big European places of pilgrimage is Santiago de Compostela in the northwest of Spain. The long-distance route across the top of Spain traditionally ran from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port or Roncesvalles in the French Pyrenees to Santiago in the northwest corner of Spain, a distance of about 500 miles. The badge in medieval times for pilgrims was a scallop shell, either tied to their staff or sewn on the front of their cloak. Santiago today has little brass scallops set in the ground to mark the traditional route into the town for pilgrims. The sight of the twin towers of the Cathedral of St James through the trees must have been a welcome sight to weary pilgrims. At my previous church, I saw a film called The Way, directed by Emilio Estevez and starring his father, Martin Sheen. It's based on this pilgrim route. If you ever get a chance to watch it, I would recommend it, and I think you can actually get it on Netflix. The number of people travelling the route has risen from a few thousand in the 1980s to over 100,000 a year in more recent times. Whilst we might deprecate the issue of indulgences for performing these pilgrimages, I have no doubt that for many it's a journey of piety and self-discovery. The Christian life is itself a pilgrimage, and we often speak about being on a journey. Perhaps we have, in the hustle and bustle of the 21st century life, begun to learn something from the measured walk of spiritual self-discovery that can be afforded by a pilgrimage. Many years ago, I visited Lourdes whilst on a camping holiday in France. Lourdes itself, a town of about 15,000 people, has as many as 5 million visitors a year, and it is a principal site of pilgrimage for Roman Catholics and has particular focus for those with a persistent illness or disability. When I was there, which was 40 odd years ago, it was very crowded. Finding anywhere to park was awful, and I came away with an impression of "get your plastic Madonnas here" pervading everything. In conversation with a Roman Catholic acquaintance subsequently, I was reassured that the serenity of the basilica across the bridge from the town itself was in complete contrast to the commercialism of the town. Mont Saint Michel in France, in Brittany, was another pilgrimage destination in medieval times. Now it's a tourist magnet, although it's no longer a Benedictine monastery. It still has an active spiritual community conducting worship in the abbey at the top. And since 1979, it has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Getting supplies to the top of the premises was a task of some magnitude, and there are still the remains of the old sled that was used to haul provisions up to the top. Returning back to UK soil, a couple of years back we spent a few days with our caravan outside Oxford, and on our way to the Ashmolean Museum we passed the Martyrs Memorial, which remembered Ridley, Latimer and Cranmer, who were burned as heretics during the reign of Henry VIII's daughter Mary. Martyrdom, as we see, didn't fizzle out with Vespasian and Diocletian, but has continued throughout the life of the Church right up to the present day. Tertullian wrote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the Church," and as we know, Christianity has spread around the globe. And this is a church that we visited some years ago when we were on a cruise in Svalbard, right up in the high Arctic. This is about 800 miles south of the North Pole. So as we can see, Christianity has indeed spread throughout the globe. The writer to the Hebrews in chapter 11 says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, that they might rise again to a better life." To whom we might perhaps add Aidan, Cuthbert, Eadfrith, Ridley, Latimer and Cranmer. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us.